generations. And so each of the generations that we present, I'm going to try to do the best that I can to make it as authentic as possible. Which means that today, since we're going to be talking about the silent generation, one thing that is very typical of the silent generation is that pastors often would roll up. And pastors would often preach behind the pulpit. So each generation finds church a little bit differently, and that's our goal as we come and we experience and we talk about each of the generations. And so today I'm going to be robed up and not only for the confirmation, which I often do, but also be behind the pulpit, and you'll find some different styles as we move forward. As I talked about, and you notice in the bulletin, we're going to talk about the silent generation. But before we do that, I want to talk about a group called the GI generation, or get this pulled up here, the GIers. So this is for anyone that was born before 1924, is considered part of the GI generation. So is it for all of you that were born before 1924, would you be willing to stand or at least wave right now? So we've got a few. All right, so here, when I first learned about generations and generational theory, we talked about your generation. And it was when I was in seminary, which was in the late 90s, one of the things that we learned about these GIers, the GI generation, is that you were recently retired. And it was your generation that was leading the charge in the church and in giving. And so when I was in seminary, we were learning about generational theory so that we could be better pastors. And ever since I took that course, I have been gaining an information and knowledge about each of the generations. Now I realize that this is a sermon about the silent generation, but we still have some GIers here. So briefly, some statistics. You are a GIer if you were born between 1901 and 1924. You are greatly influenced by the Great Depression and World War II. You were also a very wealthy generation. Now, that doesn't mean what's in your pocketbook right now. It means that over your lifetime, you earned more money than any other generation before you. And you benefited greatly from the post-World War II economic boom. Now, as a youth, the GIers, scouting was a big deal, and you all watched the same movies. As teens, FDR's New Deal came into play. When you got into the workforce, many of you went to school on the GI Bill. And when you got out, you had a sense of duty to God, to country, and to your family. But by your midlife years, you were usually in the upper echelon of business or the corporate world. And when you reached retirement, you were happy, energetic, and things were going well. And with the church, you were and still are very loyal. Your view of the church was incredibly positive with infinite growth. All you have to do is look at the Methodist church buildings that were erected in the Panhandle during your zenith, which is the 1950s. This building was built in 1953. Shadron was built in 1951. Scottsbluff and Harrison were built at the same time. Sydney by almost the end of the decade. Now, before we move to the silent generation, I want to thank the GIers that are in this room. Because of what we know about the church today is through your hard work to get it established. This church building was erected by members of the GI generation. And it is built like an ox. And money was no issue. How do we know this? Every insurance agent that comes through this church says you would never be able to afford to build that building ever again. Okay, now the silent generation. You were born between 1924 and 1943. And if this fits you, would you please be willing to stand or wave if you were in the silent generation? So, got some people waving. Okay, all right, thank you. And just like we did with your parents' generation, here's some facts for you. When you were a youth, life was very strict and very regulated. You were constantly reminded that the older generation made enormous sacrifices so you could grow up in peace and prosperity. When you came of age, you were too young for World War II, but the Korean conflict, that was your war. By your midlife years, these were the things that men were watching. Clint Eastwood and Chuck Norris and this bunny thing up there. So. And for women, many of you got married early in life, but now you are beginning to ask, is this all there is? In retirement, you realize that you were the first American generation that has never been represented by a president. Still that way. There has never been a president who has been a member of the silent generation. And I found this quote to be very telling about how you may feel. There has been a steadily growing sense of cultural decay since a young adulthood. Essentially, this is not the kind of retirement expected by previous generations. Now, I want to make this clear. This is a sermon, and this is a sermon in a series on generations. This is not an academic lecture. And so we're going to be looking at scripture that I believe represents each generation. And one I believe fits the people born between 1924 and 1943 is this one that Roger's going to read out of the book of Genesis.
This is from Genesis 22, verses 1 through 18. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He called to him, Abraham. And Abraham answered, yes, here I am. Take your son, God said, your only son Isaac, whom you have loved so much, and go to the land of Moriah. There on a mountain there I will show you. Offer him as a sacrifice to me. Early the next morning, Abraham cut some wood for the sacrifice, loaded his donkey, and took Isaac and the 2 servants with him. They started out for the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham saw the place in the distance. Then he said to the servants, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there and worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham made Isaac carry the wood from the sacrifice, and he carried the knife and live coals for starting the fire. As they walked along together, Isaac spoke up, Father? He answered, yes, my son. Isaac asked, I see that you have the coals and the wood, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice? Abraham answered, God himself will provide one, and the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place which God had told him about, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. He tied up his son and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he picked up the knife to kill him. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. He answered, yes, here I am. Don't hurt the boy or do anything to him, he said. Now that I know that you honor and obey God, because you have not kept back your only son from him. Abraham looked around and saw a ram caught in a bush by its horns. He went and got it and offered it as a burnt sacrifice instead of his son. Abraham named that place, the Lord provides. And even today people say, on the Lord's mountain he provides. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a 2nd time. I made a vow by my own name, the Lord is speaking, that I will richly bless you, because you did this and did not keep back your only son from me. I promise that I will give you as many descendants as there are stars in the sky or grains of sand along the seashore. Your descendants will conquer their enemies. All the nations will ask me to bless them as I have blessed your descendants, all because you obeyed my commands.
Thank you, Roger. I hope you heard some lessons in that passage. Specifically, sacrifice, loyalty to the institution, outreach, and mission. But before we get to those words, I'm going to share a joke with you that comes from a fellow in the silent generation, a guy by the name of Garrison Keeler. An 80-year-old couple is having problems remembering things, so they go to the doctor to get checked out. They describe for the doctor the problems that they're each having with their memory. After getting checked out, the doctor tells them that they're physically okay, but they may want to start writing things down to help them remember. The couple thanks the doctor and leaves. Later that night, while watching TV, the man says that, the man gets up from his chair and his wife asks, where are you going? And the man says, well, I'm going to the kitchen. And the wife says, well, can you get me some ice cream? And just before he walks, she says, you better write it down so you don't forget. And the guy says, no, I'll remember ice cream. And then the wife says, can you put some strawberries on it? And you better write that down because you're not going to remember that. And the guy says, I will remember ice cream and strawberries. So just before he's going on, and the woman says, can you also put some whipped cream on top of that? Again, you're going to forget that, so you better write this down. And the man, just in a huff, just turns around, I won't forget, walks into the kitchen. 20 minutes later, he comes out and brings her a plate of bacon and eggs. She stares at the plate for a moment and says, "You forgot my toast." A little jab at your age there, but also a sense of the relationships between husband and wife. For the most part, relationships in the silent generation were together. But you were the first generation to actually see a rise in the divorce rate. Now, let's go to the question that I get a lot about this generation. Why are you called the silent generation? Here's what a couple of experts have to say. Too young for the grand cause of the war. You were also too old to be hippies. You were already adults, many holding responsible jobs and parenting young children when the upheavals of the 1960s hit. This generation doesn't get much attention in American history, so you were called the silent generation. Yet, though you do not draw much attention to yourselves, your influence has been large, and you're the stalwarts of stewardship support in many of our congregations. Another expert says this: silent children watch their elders struggle against the most difficult economic times of the century. As war clouds gathered around the world in the 1930s, they were very much aware of their elders' concerns. More than ever, compliance and conformity were expected by parents who had no time or energy to address recalcitrant children. Silent children generally lived up to expectations. And then there is what my seminary professor said. Tex Sample, who taught this to us about generational theory, was a member of the silent generation. And I remember him distinctly talking about D-Day. And he said about the images of D-Day and how you had these tall cliffs and you had these German gunners at the top that would just mow everyone down. And as he and his friends would be playing, and they'd be playing soldier or war or something like that, they all realized that they could never live up to what their parents' generation and those soldiers did in the war. Now that gives us a sense of their daily life. But what about church and religion and faith? Well, Don Gentry said the sanctuary would be overflowing at Easter. We had to set up chairs in the narthex. Alice Keenan said, we were literally bursting at the seams. And Karen Parrish wrote, members wore their Sunday best to church, women wearing hats. Now those quotes take us back to that passage from Genesis. And I want you to know something about how each of us reads Scripture. Each of us reads it a little bit differently based on our educational level or our family of origin or some experience that happened in our past or maybe something that is happening to us now. And certainly the generation that we grew up in shapes how we read Scripture. And since we're talking about the silent generation here, what we find is a lesson on sacrifice, on loyalty to the institution, on specifically the idea that God knows best and Abraham knows what he is doing. But there is also a caveat lesson there. We can only take things so far. People in the silent generation will only take things so far. They may not say anything about it, but deep down a passage like this from Genesis may not sound right. Now here's something that you baby boomers probably already know, is that you were the energy for the civil rights movement. But the leaders of the civil rights movement were members of the silent generation. Martin Luther King Jr., Cesar Chavez, Sandra Day O'Connor, Clint Eastwood, Warren Buffett. These are leaders who were out for change, but they were mild in their protest. Connie Russell wrote this: when I taught Sunday school in the 60s, we did not use Methodist material because we felt it was not user-friendly to first graders. So what the silent generation did is they would take things, they were very loyal, but they improved upon it. And then Connie did say, I remember reading from a church bulletin in the early 60s of over 300 children attending Sunday school. The silent generation was committed to taking these institutions and making them better. But it included an emphasis on justice and outreach work. But only if you stay obedient to God. That is vital. Pastor Dale Allen Robbins is a member of the silent generation. Just listen to how he talks about this idea of God's provision in his life. He writes, "When I arrived home, my wife Jerry saw the worry on my face. I had $3 in my wallet, and there was 1 can of soup in the cupboard. After our meager supper, we quietly leafed through my Bible in the dim light. Tears streamed down from my eyes. I wondered whether we really were called by God. I felt like giving up. Then I thought, what alternative do I have? Who else but God do I have to turn to? I read the verse, the prayer of the righteous is powerful and effective, out of James. Encouraged yet still burdened, Jerry and I knelt at opposite ends of the little trailer to see God into the night. Into the night we prayed until sleep finally overtook us. I was awakened by a pounding at the door. From the window, I could see the brilliant orange sunrise behind the city skyline. A fresh white blanket of snow now covered the ground. Again, the knocking came. Who is it? I asked. A mystery voice replied, I've got something for you. Cautiously, I opened the door. There stood a short man with a grin on his face and 2 brown grocery bags in his arms. He quickly shoved the bags in the doorway, then turned and walked away. Jerry joined me. Stunned, we began to look through the bags. There was bread, meat, canned goods, and several cans of my favorite soup. They were the same items and brands we normally purchased. There was also a can of shaving cream. Who knew I had just used my last ounce of shaving cream? On the bottom of one sack was an envelope with cash. Later, I discovered it was the precise amount we needed at the gas station. On that wintry Saturday morning in Syracuse, my wife and I wept in our trailer and thanked God for hearing and answering our prayer. No one on the planet knew about our need, only our Lord God Almighty, and he dispatched a little grinning man to minister to us. I'd like you to pull out your bulletin right now and turn to the back page. On the bottom of that back page, you will find our core values. And one of those core values is multi-generational. Now the goal is for each of us to understand each other with the realization that each one of us comes from a varied background. But when we come together from different walks of life, we do enrich the church. And we do this with a commitment to taking care of each other, of providing for each other, and of course, helping each other. Because God says this is important. Right now, we're going to watch a video that another church did, very similar project that we did. And you'll get a sense of what they had to say about the silent generation.
Catch a falling star and hold it in your pocket, save it for a rain.
One of the things that comes to my mind that makes our generation different is the sense of personal security and safety that I had growing up in a neighborhood here in Charlotte. I never knew what it was to be fearful. I never knew what it was to see violence. I never knew what it was to have a sense of fear about going to school. And that has changed a great deal. So in our generation, that was one of the things that I think there was a sense of community and just personal security that I don't think exists anymore.
I guess one of the things, though, that does stand out for me, having been in business, was a time where a transition really began from the independent businessman to the corporations, the real growth in corporations. And the days of the corner drugstore, the corner grocery store, they're virtually gone. And what we've seen over all those years is the growth and consolidation of these large companies. And so I think what really was unique, and at least in our generation, is that if you could get a job with one of these large corporations and do well and progress, then you could have a good life.
For the first time, at least in my family, women were thinking of going to college. My predecessors in my own family, the women didn't go to college. In Norman's family, they were a family that had been college educated for a long time. But for most women, college was not the thing that you did. You got married, you had babies and so forth. But I think that having an education beyond going to high school, I think that was one of the big things that changed, and women then began to think of, well, possibly having a career outside the home.
The family, the fabric of the family was much tighter now. And while as the children began to grow up, their schedules changed and we began to go in a number of different ways. Just the fabric, the closeness, the close-knitness of the family was much better than it is today, I think.
Then I think rock and roll had an impact. Dee didn't like rock and roll, but I did. And it was sort of the American formalities breaking down, and there's a lot of freedom, and the kids, thought rock and roll, Elvis Presley, and all those music just was seen as a freedom, and it was really the beginning of the loosening of our society in a lot of ways. Some of them good, and some of them not so good.
The atomic age really began during my generation. And that had significant impact in terms of just the way countries looked at each other, the shift in world power, people building bomb shelters, and really a generation of a fear of that there always could be an attack. So the aspirations would be that our children have good lives economically, that they will live in a world where Christ is honored and not shunned, and that their Christian freedoms and liberties will not be taken away from them.
Catch a falling star and put it in your pocket, never let it fade away.
I think this video matches this statement about those in the silent generation. Members of this generation are often warm-hearted, affectionate relationship builders. They have lively intellects and will often work hard to study the Bible and religious tradition. Silents grew up in a time when church attendance was expected. Many of them still respect the religious traditions they were brought up with, though some members of their generation began drifting away from their church backgrounds, and as they grew older, moved away from their families of origin and formed new communities around work or recreational interests. For those who remained loyal to the church, they understood the importance of paying one's fair share to keep an institution running. Now, I want to thank everyone that filled out the questionnaires. And for those of you that looked at those questionnaires, you probably noticed that there was a place to mark your age. And I was specifically putting you into the generational groups that we have. And when I stacked up the listings of the questionnaires, I noticed something right away. The silent generation was very thin. And that was to be expected. You are quiet, you do your own thing. But you look at the stack for the baby boomers, it is this thick. And one thing you're going to find out next week, they like to toot their own horn. So, oh, and one more thing. And this goes to the heart of understanding generations. I want you to think about what was taking place when you were coming of age. And we're going to talk about this each week. And you probably noticed it in the video. What was coming of age for the silent generation? Nuclear war. Nuclear warfare, and the Cold War. Now, for the baby boomers, you always knew this. You always knew the Cold War. You always knew the nuclear threat. But that was different for the silent generation because they remembered, and you heard that in the video. Things were very different. And then, as they came of age, this is what was taking place. So, when you hear a passage like this out of Genesis, especially for people in the silent generation, what's it all about? It's about listening and following God. And that is vital. Why? Because you came of age in a very uncertain time. What was taking place? You were hiding underneath a desk from a nuclear war. But the future was so uncertain. You didn't know if there was going to be children, grandchildren, whatever the future. And so all you had to do was simply trust God. Now, doesn't that sound like Abraham and Isaac, what they did? But I do want to let you in on a little secret here. As we're looking at this symbol, and I think this is perfect for the silent generation, I'll let you in on a little history, benefit of history. Nuclear war didn't happen. The Soviet Union dissolved. The church is still here, although, as we've heard from the experts, a little bit smaller. I think this kind of helps put things into perspective. And I want to share with you one final story that gains a sense of what this generational sermon series is all about. On a recent trip to Hurricane Katrina ravaged coast of Mississippi, we worked at a home that was owned by a retired United Methodist pastor. Reverend Jones said he and his wife had left their home before Katrina struck and gone to a shelter. After the storm passed, they were allowed back into the city to grab a few belongings. When they entered their house, the water was still knee-high, but Jones was determined to see what he could salvage. Jones saw several framed family photos floating in the water. He didn't see anything else to save, so he grabbed the pictures and left. At the shelter, he took the photos out of their frames so they could dry out. When he removed his father's picture, money fell out of the frame. He was astonished to find and count $366. Even more astounding was the fact that his father died in 1942, when Jones himself was only 12 years old. He had no idea that the money was even in the frame. The money was precisely what he and his wife needed to go to Atlanta after the storm to live together with their family, or with his daughter. I hope you see this series as a way to pass on a gift, whether it be money or wisdom or time or effort, or the fact that God has been present at every stage in her life and will continue to be present. Amen. I'm going to turn it over now to our ushers as they wait upon us as we give back to them.